Welcome to WitchLit, a podcast where we talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Rashke, fiction author, witch, and nosy Scorpio. Lana Harper is the New York Times bestselling author of Payback's A Witch and the forthcoming From Bad to Cursed from Berkeley Books. Writing as Lana Popovich, she is also the author of YA novels Wicked Like a Wildfire, Fierce Like a Firestorm, Blood Countess, and Poison Priestess. Lana studied psychology and literature at Yale University, law at Boston University, and is a graduate of the Emerson College Publishing and Writing Master's Program. She was born in Serbia and lived in Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania before moving to the United States, where she now lives in Chicago with her family. Lana Harper, welcome to WitchLit.
Hey, Victoria, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited that we were able to get you on, and I thoroughly enjoyed your book, so I'm really looking forward to talking about that.
Thank you.
Great. So our first question, because we're a writing podcast, is why write?
Why write? I feel like I never considered a different option. Like I've been writing since I was really little. So I remember writing these super adorable / ridiculous books when I was like 7 or 8. And I would put them together into like pamphlets and then try to sell them to people. They were like, I don't want to buy your weird illustrated book, A Random Child in Bulgaria. So I've been writing for a long time and I've been reading voraciously for a long time. And then I took a break kind of where I was thinking, I'm going to go be a lawyer. Law school is the path. That's what's going to happen. And then it became abundantly clear that I hated it and it was not what I wanted to do with my life. So the first novel that I wrote, I drafted in my last year of law school. And it was like a wonderful refuge because I had become very aware that that wasn't the path that I wanted to take. And then it was shelved for a number of years when I went on to get my publishing and writing master's degree at Emerson, and then resurrected after I became a literary agent. So I feel like in one way or another, I've always been writing, and that's always been, whether it was academic or whether it was fiction or for pleasure, it's something that I've always felt a compulsion to do, which doesn't mean that that it's easy, because sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is just tooth-pullingly hard, but I've always felt happier and better and more at ease with myself when I was writing. So I think, at least in a personal sense, I write because I feel like I have to be happy. I'm not sure if that's true for a lot of people, but it does feel to me like a vocation.
Yeah, I do think that. I think that is true. I mean, most of the people I've talked to, most of the writers I know, feel like they really started very young and it was always just kind of part of who they were. There is also that weird like English major to law school pipeline too.
This is a real thing. Definitely. Yeah. Definitely is. I don't know why it happens. And it's funny because I think those are not really the skills that you need as a lawyer. You probably should be taking different classes, like something more logical and like less meandering, because I didn't feel like any of my literature or English classes really helped in any way once I was in law school. But it's for sure that's a trajectory that happens often.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you also became a literary agent. So what did finally getting published look like? So you had this novel that you drafted in law school that you've been taking with you through this journey. So how did that finally become a book for you?
It did not become a book. That first one did not become a book. It was a sapphic vampire contemporary fantasy, and I got my agent with it, but she was also a really close friend from Emerson, who at the time was starting out on her agenting career as well. So she was like, I'd really love to represent you. And I was like, that would be amazing, because I hadn't really thought we were going to do anything with this book. And so we went out with it pretty widely, and it did not sell. It did not sell at all. And there was a lot of requests for revise and resubmit. And there was in some ways significant pushback to the fact that it was a queer story in that field at the time, which it just wasn't quite the moment for it. And then we just shelved it, and I kind of went back to the drawing board. And by then I was representing quite a bit of young adult myself. And so it seemed like an organic kind of next step to do a YA project. And so that was when I wrote Wicked Like a Wildfire, which was called Hibiscus Daughter at the time. So we went out with that, I think in 2014. And then we sold it in 2015, and that was my first book that actually sold. So Covenant got got put in a drawer forever and is never coming back out.
Be your juvenilia in your papers.
Yeah. Exactly. Like that doesn't need to see the light of day. I loved it. There's still parts of it that I really enjoy, but yeah, it was very much a debut or just a first time effort. And I feel like I've gotten much more confident and I'm a very different writer now. So it deserves to stay in the drawer.
Yeah, those the practice books are not a bad thing. That's for sure. I have one of those locked up in a drawer too. So I feel you on that. So you write pretty much full time now, or do you still represent other folks?
No, I don't represent. I stopped agenting in 2018. I just felt like I was getting spread too thin and I wanted to see what I could do if I wrote full time. So I switched over to writing just my own fiction and then also screenwriting for Pixelberry Studios, who produce one of those choose your own adventure apps that you might have seen. There's this Choices, which I really love actually. Choices is super fun and they have a lot of different genres. So I wrote 2 different books for them. Hopefully I'll be doing another project for them this year. I took a little bit of a break in the meantime. But I had been writing both my own works and then work for hire for publishers as well. So my second 2 books, which were the Lady Slayer series, Blood Countess and Poison Priestess, those were work for hire. So they were IP originated by Abrams. They were looking for a writer. I auditioned and got those projects. And then in the meantime, I did that as well as focusing on my own work, which was a thriller, and then eventually also Payback.
Yeah. So what was it like writing for IP? I would imagine that's very different.
It is different, but it's also really satisfying. I enjoyed it. I had never previously written to any kind of outline. Like I had sort of a thoughts document that I would use at a time, but I very rarely had like a clear beat by beat of the plot. And I found it really helpful. So it taught me a lot in terms of how much more confident I would feel if I organized some of the story in advance. And I'm still partially a pantser. I can't really, I can't lay it out to the kind of degree that a lot of other authors use. Like, they have like 10-page outlines. I don't do that. But it taught me kind of the shape of a story, the beats that you really need, how to organize something into acts. So in that sense, it was really satisfying. And I felt like it was a great experience for me and like my development as a writer.
No, that makes sense. I feel you on the I like the term discovery writer a little better than pantser.
That's great. That is better. But it's still scary. I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to
really
discover.
Scary.
Will it be good?
And I am somewhere in the middle. Like you said, I plan out like the arc of the story.
Same.
It's not like a beat, like you said, there's not a beat to beat outline just because I wouldn't follow it anyway. I'd do all that work and then I'd go do something else. So
yeah, I don't know if I even could. My brain doesn't work that way. I don't know what's going to happen next precisely. Like even when I do, I have what I call like the signal fire scenes where I know they have to happen. But there's like 7 or 8 of those. And I'm like, what happens in between? I don't know. Like we're going to find out. So I've gotten better at outlining, but it's still nowhere near. I would still call myself, at least a 45% discovery writer at this point.
Well, you just never know like what those characters are going to do once they're on the page is how I feel like I'm getting to know them too a little bit. So you went from writing YA to writing this new series that starts with Payback's a Witch. So what was the impetus to kind of switch from writing YA to writing for adults?
I had always felt like YA was a little bit of an uneasy fit for me. I started writing it because I felt like I knew the terrain since I was representing a number of YA writers at the time, but it just wasn't it wasn't the best fit. It wasn't the themes and the coming of age and the conflicts weren't really what I wanted to be talking about. And so I was consistently getting the feedback where it was like, well, this reads very adult, and it's longer and wordier and generally denser than YA is meant to be. And I found it to be a little bit more restrictive than what I wanted to be talking about. So what I was planning on doing next after the Lady Slayers books was an adult thriller. And I had that finished, and my agent and I were editing it. And then she just happened to have been in New York, like back when like agents did meetings in person. This was definitely pre-pandemic era. And she was like, I keep hearing rom-com editors tell me that they really want magical rom-coms, like they want like a witchy rom-com. And I know that you've wanted to get into that space. So what do you think about doing something like that? And I was like, that sounds awesome. It would be so fun. It's like a natural segue from YA, but I don't have like a clear idea of what exactly I would write in that space. And so she and I brainstormed for like a couple of weeks, and she would just send me like one line ideas. And one of them was literally John Tucker must die, except everyone is witches. And two of the ladies fall in love with each other. And I was like, that's it. That's the one. It's the one I want. And then I kind of spun it out from there, developed the idea of a magical town and four families and a gauntlet, like a magical tournament. But it was just that kind of organic progression from I knew I wanted to be in the adult space, but I still wanted it to have that speculative feel. I still wanted it to feel fresh and young in some ways. So it was like, it felt very much like the natural next step.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems like reading the first book, like just the world building, like clearly a lot of work went into this because there's so many aspects, like the lore and the families. And I know it's just such a rich tapestry to kind of walk into.
Thank
So
you.
like it almost seems like one of those where you kind of hear people talk about, oh yes, this character came to me with this fully born idea. So it's nice to know that
Yeah.
that can happen and it not look like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Well, it sort of it did a little bit in the sense that as much as that like initial nugget was not mine, a lot of the rest of it when I was building it out before I started writing, this is so cheesy, and I have never said this about any of my other books, but it felt like I was discovering something that existed instead of inventing it, because it was so easy and it felt
Mhm.
so effortless and fun. Like it didn't feel like labor. It just felt like I was coming back to this place that brought me joy consistently, and one thing led to another. And a lot of it was very much like lucid dreaming, like the constellation of what did the four families look like, what kind of powers do they have, what is their ancestry, how did they come to be in this town, what are their dynamics. It just felt easy and discoverable rather than inventable, which is a
Mhm.
weird feeling, and I had never had it before. So I loved it. It was especially great because I was writing a lot of it like mid-pandemic, and I was planning a move to Chicago, and I was very stressed out. I had a really young baby who had cardiac issues when he was born, and he's fine. He's lovely and healthy now, but it was just such a stressful, fraught time. So to have this thing be so joyful and wonderful was like, it was really just a gift. And
Yeah.
I have never felt that way with any of my other books. So I'm very lucky to have had that experience. And even the sequel, like, or rather the next installment, was that similar kind of happy. So there's something about these books that just like really does it for me.
Mhm.
That sweet spot of like, wow, it's work, but it's really fun.
Yeah, I am doing a lot more reading with starting the podcast, and like, a lot of it's nonfiction because I talk to a lot of nonfiction authors. And some of those will keep me up, but like I lost some sleep reading your book because I was like, yeah, I got to find out what happens next. Because it was just like you said, it's a really lovely place to be. Like the people just feel very real and the place feels very real. So it's just a lovely experience. And when you and I kind of chatted back and forth on email to set up the thing, we talked about like this like zeitgeist moment around
Mhm.
witches in fiction and like just witches in pop culture and in general. And it's interesting to know that that was, also happening in New York pre-pandemic times. They were having these conversations. But so what do you think is the like the why is this wave what it is? Why are we in this like pop culture witch boom, do you think?
I mean, partly I think it's because social media facilitates these kinds of moments so well. And then social consciousness in general seems to be shifting in kind of the direction of self-empowerment and manifestation. And then you have the convergence of things like the Me Too movement and just generally women trying to stand in their power or reclaim their power in certain ways. And the witch archetype can really be that, I think, for a lot of
Mhm.
people, where it's a certain kind of power that is sometimes perceived as dangerous and ugly, but is really like the strongest that you can imagine yourself to be. But it can also be, I think part of it is like, now that we have Instagram and TikTok and all of that, it can also be beautiful. Like you have these
Mhm.
lovely witchy aesthetics. And so it's like power, community, because you're finding other people and discovering that you have these similar interests and you're feeling aligned with them. And then almost at the same time, it can feel like a form of self-care. Because like a lot of the things that you see is like, oh, here's a spell, or like here's a way to celebrate one of the Wheel of the Year holidays, feel very indulgent and very like self-focused in a way that can seem wonderful. So I think a lot of it depends also on the practitioner, because a lot of witches, I say, prioritize their connection with the land and kind of where they are. But I think that that's person specific, and the kind of broader appeals are probably just reflections of what many of us are hungry for, women
Mhm.
specifically, and especially in Trump's America and post-Trump. So it was just a moment where it was like all of us really wanted this kind of strength, and this was a ready way to look for it, enabled by social media.
Mhm.
My
Yeah.
theory. I'm not really sure
No,
where it
no,
came
I
from.
mean, I think I agree with you. And partly too, I think the other layer of it is, like you kind of mentioned Me Too and like politics and all that. And I think when things are rough, and obviously have been politically with the pandemic, with, climate crisis, all this stuff, it's also, like you said, a way to reclaim some power in
Yeah,
that situation that a lot of other kind of more mainstream belief systems don't give you in the same way.
100%. That's
So,
definitely must be part of it.
mhm,
And it's so individual, like it really is. It's not like one size fits all. You can tailor it infinitely.
mhm,
And that's really, I think, wonderful, because it's not restrictive. Obviously, if you're doing something very formal like joining a coven, then you have rules and you have certain practices, but otherwise you really have a lot of freedom in how you can express, your devotion or the way that you approach the craft. So I think that's probably appealing to a lot of people too, and how flexible it is.
yeah, and I feel like your book, I mean, it is rom-com and it is lovely and all that, but I feel like it hits on 2 really important things. Like, it hits on obviously in this kind of empowerment and taking that back with the main character, like, that's her arc in so many ways,
Mm,
but also, like, just how important witchcraft and the occult and paganism is in the queer community too. Like,
mhm.
there's that seems to also be an overlap, and that's definitely part of the book. So I feel like you just kind of hit the right you just hit the right place at
Yeah,
the right time.
bisexual witches, yeah, it was the sweet spot. I mean, it really, I very much wanted it, whatever the rom-com was going to be, I wanted it to be a bisexual romance. Like that was
Mhm,
always going to happen. Um, and the fact that it was witches, which is funny because a long time ago, I was writing a bisexual witch character, and an editor told me that that was a cliche. And I was like, really? I I didn't know that. I had no idea that there was something about this, like that is somehow a stereotype, like witches are bi. Okay. But it does, I think that there is an overlap. Like there is a
mhm,
certain alignment there. And there are awesome ways that kind of the craft fits into representation of queer communities and just generally social justice. I think it tends more in that direction when it's being
mhm,
like leveraged for a useful purpose, because I've definitely seen some strange conspiracy theories that also like there are for sure practitioners who are more towards the right than I would expect, but I think that's more rare. That's rarer
mhm.
than seeing the sort of more inclusive, diverse, and to me much more valuable version of embracing the occult and the craft and all of that.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Um, so
I also, sorry, I
oh,
didn't
go
mean
ahead.
to
No,
cut
no,
you off.
no.
The other thing that I always like to mention with regard to that story is I really wanted to create the kind of bisexual romance that was going to be non-angsty. Like the kind of obstacles they have nothing to do with coming out, to do with them being attracted to, both of them are women, and that's not the point of the story. No one's like hung up on that. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted it to feel in some ways like a happy place romance
Mm-hmm.
for queer readers, where they weren't going to have to deal with any of the kind of more fraught stuff that comes with that, because all of the Emmy and Talia issues really boil down to human stuff, like the stuff that any couple might face,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to very specific queer coming out stories. So that was important to me because I had a very hard time finding books like that when I was looking for them, and I really wanted this to be one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is one of the things that stood out to me about the book too. Like there's literally no discussion amongst the people around them about it. It just is a thing, which is lovely.
It's what it is.
Yeah. I appreciate that so much. And we talked a little bit before, and like I said, I had listened to another interview with you. So I know that you are a practitioner or practitioner adjacent at the moment, perhaps. But
Exactly.
how did your own views of your witchcraft or the witchcraft you've practiced or been involved with, how did that inform how you wanted the magic to look like in the book? Because I mean, obviously fictional magic is bigger magic,
Yeah.
it is a special effects budget where
Exactly.
practicing witches is not so much like that. So how did your actual practice inform what you wanted the magic in the book to look like?
I would say it's exactly what you just described. Very little. So what I did want to highlight were things like the Wheel of the Year holidays, kind of the more common pagan practices, tarot, divination, but clearly this is very flashy magic. Like it's just not the kind of magic practitioners see. And I wanted it to be that way. I wanted it to feel accessible and dramatic, and not kind of the deeper, maybe even darker. Like my experience with what I would term magic is definitely not as sparkly as what I see in the book, and I wanted it to not be off-putting. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've written other witch books in which magic was more complex, more nuanced, more sinister in some ways. And to be fair, the Abramovs practiced necromancy, right? So like it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Like
Right.
for sure there's a darker element to Thistle Grove magic as well. But my experience with it has been more subtle and darker, and I think in some ways more interesting, but maybe not what I wanted for this kind of book. So if anything, I was like, hey, don't do that. Like go the other way. Because typically in my witch books, I'm like, oh, we're gonna have a TED talk. Like we're gonna have rules, a really elaborate magical system. We're gonna know exactly how this works. Like sometimes there'll be pages of exposition about like how does this spell happen. And I didn't want that to bog people down. Like I wanted there to be clear rules, but I wanted them to be easily graspable without like too much effort expended there, so that the
Mm-hmm.
story fell, to the back, to the side, while people were like, well, how does this work? Like that wasn't really the point. So I think the clearest way that my practice informed it is just that I think it's valuable and it's important and it's a very attractive, compelling element to someone's life. So Emmy's kind of missing her magic and missing that community is something that I've certainly felt in my life. And so I wanted that kind of sense of yearning to come across, and that's probably where it plays in the strongest.
Yeah. I like too that one of the things you set up in the book is that magic is not a currency per se, but there is like a class issue
Mm-hmm.
in the book around who has what kind of power. And I thought that was handled really deftly. But I mean, was that kind of something you wanted to talk about going into the book, or did that just kind of evolve out of what was going on with the families?
It really, I wanted to have that set up, just because for sort of most communities that tends to happen. There are very few incredibly egalitarian communities, and often the question of power is what drives a lot of the tension in many stories, magical or not. So I came into it knowing that the families wouldn't be equal. I didn't necessarily think that Emmys would be such on the kind of lowest rung of the magical ladder, but then at the same time, once I had the idea of why don't we give them pretty serious power disparities, it led to different revelations and kind of the later twists, and things that we discover as the plot moves on. So
Mm-hmm.
it was partially intended and partially was just because, it's a gauntlet, they're competing. But the idea that there's one family who has such a leg up is very true to what I've seen in the world. So
Yes.
why wouldn't that be the case? Even in a magical town, like someone's gonna have that starting advantage. And how does everyone else deal with it? How does that impact kind of the dynamics of all of the families, even when they're all witches? I thought it would be interesting to explore that as kind of a microcosm of how things happen in our world.
Yes. Oh, that makes sense. So we know there's a second book coming already.
Yeah.
Folks can pre-order From Bad to Cursed. So how, like, once you build this family, like, how did you just all these families really, how did you decide like who your next, I guess, couple would be? Or like, do you have several books planned out in the
Yes.
series, or kind of like, how is that, how is writing a series looking for you, I guess, is really the question.
So for the second book, I knew I wanted it to be from an Abermont point of view because they're not so secretly my favorite. Like, you're not supposed to play favorites, but they're my favorite. I just lie about it when people ask me, and I say, no, I don't have one, but I do. And it's them.
They were my favorite too.
Like, you guys are the sexiest and the weirdest. Like, I wouldn't be one. That's the sad part. Like, I totally wouldn't be one, but aspirationally speaking, they're the family I would want to be part of. So I knew I wanted it to be them. And that's why I had a moment of like, oh, and it would be cool if it was Talia's sister. What would be the greatest conflict and the greatest drama? Obviously, set her up with a thorn, because those two, they're polar opposites. They're not exactly enemies, but they have a very complicated feuding family history. So like, let's create this very tense, fraught situation in which they're both personally arch enemies, and then also kind of opposed to each other based on their families at large. So I knew that I wanted that to be the setup for the next book. And then for the third book, I was like, well, it's got to be a Blackmore. And I thought it was going to be difficult to write because the Blackmores are, relatively speaking, much more unlikable than the other families. But then I got into it and I loved it. And at this point, it might be my favorite of the three books. So that one is actually finished. The first draft was just handed in. So I can't say anything more about it, but it will come out, I believe, at the end of the year. So all three will be done before the year is out.
Nice. And From Bad to Cursed, when does that come out?
That comes out on May 17th. So we're actually quite close. Yeah. Not that far off. Yeah. And there's lots of like fun social media stuff is going to start happening. There's a Goodreads giveaway happening now. And then there's going to be a signed pre-order with Anderson's Bookshop, and probably like a sweepstakes of some sort.
Awesome. So is this a trio of books, or do you think it will go on beyond the third book?
I would feel comfortable if it was just the trilogy, but at the same time, I think there's a lot more stories in Thistle Grove, and I would be equally happy to continue telling them for a while. So I'm not sure of the details on that, but I would be happy to move on to something else, but I would also be really thrilled to keep writing in that space.
Yeah, it's it's a difficult thing to walk, I think, sometimes, because there definitely is something to having like something complete and wrapped up and in a trilogy, or even 4 or 5 books. And then there's also those people who are on like book 50.
Exactly.
Like, I don't know how you do that.
I think you just keep sinking deeper and deeper into the world. And it helps if it's not sequels. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like in this case, it does, the From Bad to Curse does happen after the events of the first book, but you don't necessarily have to have read the first book. Actually, you definitely don't have to have read it to enjoy it. So they are, standalones in that sense.
Yeah. Also, I think easier to like the romance series, because they're usually a new couple. Like, I feel like that's a little easier work to have them be standalone than if you are really following this like long arc of one character or a couple characters through several books. So
exactly,
that makes sense. And probably easier to get to book 50 than if you're talking about the same people.
I know.
For 50 books.
I actually always think of Jim Butcher when it comes to these like even though there's many more people who are even more prolific than he is, but I'm just like, wow, like you keep, and I love all of them.
Yeah.
So it's clearly very possible to continue achieving character development and fascinating new aspects of the world, even if the world is just Chicago. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's not that big of a world, relatively speaking. So yeah, it's possible for sure, but it's no easy feat. So I don't know that I
Yeah.
can sustain 50 books, but perhaps.
Yeah. Well, and I think like you said with Jim Butcher, one of the interesting things, and I think a lot about the books, the series that continue to go and continue to be good, like at this that they're performing at the same level, like the writer is performing at the same level and they're selling at the same level, tend to be ones that have a way to be naturally episodic. Like his are kind of based around a case. So I think, in that way they're easier to do. But yeah, if you just have like, a witch in the world, like I don't know how you do that for 50 books.
Exactly.
It'd be nice to figure that, I guess, to crack that thing, but it's difficult. So you have written for YA, you've been a literary agent, you've written for adults, you have been a New York Times bestseller. So what are your goals from here, like with the series or with your writing in general?
I would like to really sustain this level because it's taken a lot of time and effort to get here where I feel comfortable in saying, okay, this is a real career now. I can fully support myself with it. And I'm very proud of myself for having gotten here. And I never would have made it without my parents' support and just a very, very strong network of people kind of pushing me here. The New York Times bestseller list was a tremendous dream for me. I wanted that so badly, but really didn't think it was going to happen,
Mhm.
especially for a queer book. Payback was actually the first Berkeley queer book to hit the list. So it was really massive for my editor and me and the whole team. It's one of the 3 times in my life that I've ugly cried and cried, actually, not just ugly cried, but happy cried. Like it was just such a huge moment. So really, if I can just keep building from there. And it's hard. That's the thing is like, oh, well, Payback had a New York Times review as well in the romance column and it hit the list. Those are the dreams. If
Mhm.
I could repeat any of those things for the next book, that's what I would ultimately want. Of course, there's always like the fun possibility of TV and film adaptations. And we do have something in the works, fingers crossed, hopefully. You can never really count on that piece of things, but
Yeah.
there is interest and movement there, and that would be amazing. Like that's really the coolest thing that I can imagine, because of course, how could it not be?
Yeah.
So if I can just sustain kind of the momentum that we have, and then also throw something wildly awesome like that into the mix, I would be very happy.
Well, and I feel like that, I mean, especially for books that have done so well, like that optioning piece seems a lot more possible in a world where like
Mhm.
everybody is making visual content.
Yeah.
Like there's just so many like I've been watching Discovery of Witches like half the people in the world. And
Mhm.
just thinking about like as a writer, like what it would look like to have your world translated that way. And the good things and the bad things. And obviously Deborah Harkness has had a lot of control because she's the executive
Yeah.
producer, but
Yeah.
still, I mean, they made changes that I think, made it a better visual story
Mhm.
that worked. So that is pretty exciting to think about. I will keep my fingers crossed for you.
Me too.
And for
Me
me,
too.
because I think I would enjoy watching that too. So, well, and I mean, that would be exciting to get like a romance series that leads with a queer couple.
Yeah, it
Like that
would
would
be
be super
incredible.
exciting. So,
Yeah, I would love it so much. So I'm trying to art of detachment gently wish for it in a
yes.
very furious way.
Yes.
Because it would be such a dream.
So speaking of, like those possibilities, so what do you see as your relationship with your readers, and what do you hope they take away from your stories, like specifically with this book or your work
Yeah.
in general?
With this book, I specifically hope that they find it an escapist read and that it makes them happy. Like I wanted this book to be that kind of comfort, bright light read that someone's excited to get to, that they makes them feel good, like after a long day. And especially queer readers, I get a lot of messages from bisexual couples, especially, who are like thrilled because it so rarely is a relationship that you see portrayed, particularly without angst. So I want it to be a happy escape, and I want people to feel like Thistle Grove is for them. They can experience being there. They can imagine living there. And it's somewhere that they want to revisit, as a place of like, not just excitement, but also comfort. So really, more than any of my other books, I hope that this is a happy book for readers.
I think you achieved that. I mean, based on my experience as reader, I think
Thank
you
you.
achieved that. Like I said, it was just a lovely place to visit. And even like you said, the darker elements of the, the Abramov's magic, it's still dealt with in a way that kind of feels really lovely around those topics of ancestors and death and spirits. And like, it is darker magic than the other parts of the book, but it's still presented in this very beautiful way.
I'm really glad.
So, no, I think you did it. So
Thank you.
So we talked a little bit about upcoming projects, but where, like if people want to reach out and like follow you on social media or connect with you, like what's the best way for people to do that?
I am mostly on Instagram. So that is the best way to reach out to me. I'm at Lana Light on Instagram, LANALYTE. I try to be really diligent about answering DMs and featuring stories and doing all that. I really love connecting with readers there, especially because it's such a visual medium, which I really enjoy. So I always try to encourage people to reach out and, expect a response from me if I can at all pull one off. And then I'm also on Twitter, but not very much. I don't engage nearly as much there as I do on Instagram. And then I'm also always reachable with my contact form on my website, which is lanapopovicbooks.com.
Great. And then I will also put links to all that and then a way to pre-order the book in the show notes. Awesome. Or this may come out actually after, but I'll make sure there are links to buy the books.
Perfect.
And all there. And then I sent you this, so you are aware. I like to surprise people, but not everybody likes surprises. So I always give people a heads up on this. So our last question is a little bit of a game of chance, and I'm going to roll a die. And depending on what I roll, I'll ask you another question and a couple follow-ups about one of these topics: death, sex, religion, politics, or money. All those good things we're told not to talk about in Polite Company. Or if I roll a 6, you'll get to pick which one you'd like.
Sweet.
1, death.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. That was my number 2 choice and what I wanted to talk about. That's great.
So after we talk about, the dark Abramovs and their necromancy. So if you were in the middle of writing a series and sadly died, because it would be sad, of course.
Would be sad.
Would you want someone to finish the series, or do those characters go to the grave with you?
Oh, I would definitely want someone to finish the series. I hate nothing more than when one of my series gets interrupted by someone dying sadly. So I absolutely think like those characters exist beyond me. They're not mine anymore. As soon as they're on the page and they exist in other people's headcanons, I think that they are up for grabs, and it would be an honor, actually. I can't have a better legacy and a tribute to after having died sadly than someone else finishing my series. So 1000% I would want them to carry on for me.
Is there a series that you feel that you wish someone had done that with?
I know that there is. I can't think of one now, but I know that there's been series where I was like, oh, that really needed more installments. And the reason that didn't happen was because the author died. I can't think of one now, but I will think on it and get back to you, because I know that I have a couple that I've thought about in the past. I just can't think of them now.
Yeah, I was thinking like I know Neil Gaiman and Ian Colfer both wrote some stuff for Douglas Adams series. And initially I kind of didn't go there. Like I was just like, I don't know if I want to read these or not. And then I read them and they were lovely. I mean, it was obviously not Douglas Adams writing.
Yeah.
But I think they were lovely tributes to his characters and the world, kind of just frenetic world that he creates in books. But no, I agree. I think for the most part, I think once those characters leave us and go out into the world, they don't belong to us anymore.
I just thought today they actually didn't tag me. It just was the hashtag of one of it was either Lana Harper books or Payback's a Witch. And it was how to make Talia Avramov. And they were combining Yennefer of Engenberg with Martha Stewart to make Talia. And I was like, this is flawless. I love it. You're correct.
That is pretty perfect, actually.
Yeah,
that's a great description.
they did like a star chart. They were like, here's, she was like Mars and Scorpio and something else in Venus. And I was like, this is genius. I am so glad that someone did this because I love everything about it. But yeah, I mean, they don't belong. I wouldn't have said that. But once I saw someone else say it, I was like, you're right. Like it's true.
Yeah. Well, even Martha's domestic goddess has a little archness to it. Like, so it's perfect. Yeah.
She's definitely got like the spice and the salt, and arch is the perfect word for both her and Talia. So I totally agree.
No, I love it. Yeah. And I just, the idea that, like you said, like with those kind of things and, fan art and all the stuff that happens once those characters, it's just interesting to see how they populate other people's imaginations.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, excellent. Well, Lana, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been lovely. And I cannot wait for From Bad to Cursed to come out because I can't wait to read it. I've already got it pre-ordered. Yay. And I just wish you all the best of luck and another New York Times bestseller and a series. I'm going to wish that for you.
Fingers crossed. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for having me and for taking the time to chat. And I'm also excited about all those things. So like, may the good vibes happen there.
Great. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Keifel Agostini, who also designed our logo. Our music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew K. End, licensed from Pixabay. You can find transcripts and all our previous episodes at witchlitpod.com and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at witchlitpod. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe and consider giving us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other witches find the show. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.